Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ask an SRE at Dash 2021. My name is Dan. I'm an engineer on the community team here at Datadog, and I am joined by my illustrious, the man who needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway, Leo Cavai, who is the director of SRE here at Datadog. Would you like to say hello to our fine audience, Leo?
Thank you. Hi everyone.
So as you can see, we are ready to go. We have a lot of good content lined up for you here. So this is going to be kind of going in two parts. I'm going to start with a little bit of let's call it a little presentation, a little introduction to SRE, the world of SRE. We're going to talk about a little bit of terminology, some team topologies, some good stuff just to lay the groundwork for our Q&A session with Leo, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we all have the same idea about what different words mean, and we can all start from that same basis. After I do the presentation, we're going to move, as I said, into a Q&A. And if you are, and I hope you are, logged in to hop in now, of course, how else would you be watching the show if you weren't? You can use the chat function. You can use the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring those and asking questions. Hopefully some good ones. And you know what? We'll have a few as
Questions?
well to kick it off. Don't be shy, but it's okay if you are. We'll get the ball rolling shortly thereafter. So without further ado, I'm just going to pop right into a handful of artisanal, handcrafted slides made especially for you. And then Leo will, we'll hop back in afterwards and have a little bit something to say. So here we go. Ask an SRE at Dash 2021. Again, my name is Dan. I'm joined by Leo. And really, what are we talking about here today? So we're going to be looking at three things, right? Three sort of broad topics that we're going to go through super, super quick. Okay. First, we're going to clear up some confusion about what some terms mean, some loaded terms, right? So DevOps and SRE. We're going to talk a little bit about on how you can find and grow SRE talent. And again, this is just the icebreaker. This is just the really putting our toes into the water so we get to that good content with Leo. We'll expand on some of these topics. And finally, we're going to talk about team and organizational structure. So the important elements to understand how to organize yourself and your teams and your organization once we have a little bit of that good SRE talent. So let's dive right in and that first topic. Now, to be clear, I don't want to dwell on the word DevOps here, okay? But the fact is that the word DevOps and the term SRE share a relationship, right? And there's no point trying to pretend like that's not true. So to understand SRE and to have a common basis of terminology, we also need to understand the word DevOps. And it's a big word, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So I've been involved in the DevOps movement for over a decade now. And one of the primordial elements of DevOps is this acronym, this four-letter acronym, the CAMS, right? CAMS, that comes up time and time again. And I'm always coming back to it because for me, this is the heart of the word DevOps. And it actually helps to explain a lot about what SRE is and does and what it can do for you. So the first one, and it's perhaps a little unfortunate that we start with the letter C because it's the biggest one, it's the most difficult one, is for culture. So culture, again, it's a loaded word. Now, I am not a sociologist, right? So for me, when I talk about culture, I'm basically talking about almost like a social contract, a set of mores, agreements that we have in a place of business, right? About how we choose to interact with each other, how we choose to communicate with each other. Also, a little of our history, our sagas, our in jokes, and things like this, right? These are all things that sort of build up that culture. So we talk about DevOps, we're talking about all of that. We're talking about a culture of the following three things. The next one is A, automation. We can automate things for automation's sake, right? And that's not a bad idea. Okay. We talk about, oh, we do this repetitive task over and over again. Maybe we get the computer to do it instead, and that's fine. But in the context of DevOps and ultimately in the context of SRE, when we talk about automation, we're not just talking about a script firing somewhere. What we're talking about is unlocking human potential. And I know that you're like, wait, where did you go from writing a bash script to unlocking human potential? And follow me on this one because it's quite a trip. When we talk about automation, we're talking about reducing toil, and that's the word we're going to get to when we talk a little bit more about SREs, the word toil. These sort of repetitive tasks that we do over and over again, often with no or minor variations, that have a lot of steps that are sometimes serial, sometimes parallel, and we do them over and over again as people. And we think to ourselves, why am I doing this over and over again? Well, I'll just let the computer do it. And that level 1 realization is, well, I don't have to do it anymore, so that makes me happy. But the level 2 realization there is, wait a minute, now I'm free to start doing things the computer can't do, to start innovating, to start thinking about hard problems, to start bringing other people together on those hard problems. And that's the cool thing about automation, is it's not just freeing yourself from the toil of repetitive tasks. You're actually unlocking yourself and those around you, unlocking that potential to do bigger and more interesting things, to innovate. And that's one of the powerful tenets of DevOps. The next one there is measurement, M. What do we measure? Well, everything, right? If it moves, measure it. If it doesn't move, measure it just in case, right? And we have that level 1 realization there, which is we do need to measure things because that's how we understand the effects of what it is that we're doing. That's how we understand, whether our systems are down or up, how many widgets are we selling, right? But then that sort of level 2 thinking on it is, wait a minute, what if we apply the idea of measurement to these other principles? What if we measure the impact of what it is that we've automated, right? How is that bringing us along on our journey? Is there ways to measure cultural aspects of our organization? And then we start to think about the 4th item on this list, which is S for sharing. Because once we've automated things, we've unlocked human potential, and once we've started to measure things, we're measuring the impact of those automations, we then have to communicate on that. We have to share on that. We have to teach others, and we have to enable others and unlock other potential as well within our own organization. And becomes this sort of wonderful feedback loop where we're doing good and we understand the good that we're doing. And I realize that sounds like kind of, whoa, my gosh, very philosophical, very pie in the sky, but these are real applicable principles that we'll get into when we talk about SRE. We also can't talk about SRE without talking about this, right? The Google book, right? The SRE handbook. And there's also a workbook that goes along with it. And it's basically impossible to describe SRE, without understanding of DevOps. And in this book, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but they basically say that DevOps is an idea, whereas SRE is an implementation. It's debatable, and a lot of people have debated, including at Google, whether that's an accurate interpretation. But it's a base interpretation that you can use to figure out your journey, to figure out where you are and what you're doing, and use that as a bit of a guiding principle. And then, of course, adapt it to your own flavor. And speaking of guiding principles and adapting things to your own flavor, be careful with this book. It is an excellent source of information. And was written by a number of very intelligent people, but it represented and continues to represent a point in time and a way of thinking at a particular organization by a particular group of people. That organization being Google, that particular time being 2016. It isn't necessarily what you're doing at your organization. It isn't necessarily what you're doing for your own teams and your own context. So don't adopt everything in here blindly. Read it, interpret it, discuss it with the stakeholders, discuss it with your peers, and figure out how you can adapt it within your own organization. And we'll get, again, a little bit more speaking to that topic when we chat a little bit with Leo in a few moments. So I cleared up a little bit about DevOps, introduced the idea of SRE and specifically that book and talking about that. But let's dive into a little bit on how we can find and grow SRE talent. Because once we know, wait, I like the DevOps, I want to do the DevOps, and SRE sounds cool, I want to implement these ivory tower principles, how do I do that? And the way that you do that is with people, right? That's really the core of SRE is people, is humans, right? And so how do we foster that talent? How do we build that talent? How do we find that talent? How do we retain that talent? These are extremely challenging questions. And again, we're going to dip our toes into the water here now. So one of the things that I would like to express here and for you to take home with you at the end of this is that SRE is people, and people have personalities, sometimes really big personalities, right? Systems people can be all over the map, right? And I'm not trying to make this an exhaustive list. right? It's not like if you're looking for the perfect unicorn SRE candidate that this is the checklist. That's not what I'm trying to get across. However, these are a couple of points here, which we'll go over, which we have seen time and time again as aspects of high-performing SRE individuals and aspects of high-performing SRE teams, both at Datadog and within our larger customer base in the community as well. One of those important aspects, and I put it at the top of the list because in some ways it's the most obvious, is you have to have a level of patience for staring at code, for staring at systems, for staring at stacks. In fact, I could probably just cut that bullet point to one word, and that's patience. All right? Having the capacity to slow down and wait for the answer to reveal itself is important, right? Not jumping to conclusions, not firing from the hip, right? Patience for staring at code and oftentimes for staring at other people's code, right? Our SREs at Datadog spend a lot of time staring at the Kubernetes code base, for example, staring at the Kafka code base, for example, right? So the ability to slow down and find and derive enjoyment from that pace is an important aspect, important personality aspect we see, again, in a lot of high-performing SREs. And that leads to that second one, which is enjoying problem solving. And I know this is on every single job ad you've ever seen since the dawn of computers. You have to enjoy problem solving. I'm not talking about that in the abstract sense. I literally mean solving problems. A lot of what SREs do is solving problems, right? And that isn't necessarily the entire job. It's not meant to be the entire job, but it's something that, again, high-performing SRE teams find a certain pleasure in, derive a certain pleasure in that. It's important. The capacity for self-teaching, that third point on there, that's important, right? You can go to school to learn programming principles. You can go to school to learn engineering. You can go to school to do a lot of different things. You can't, as far as I know, currently get a degree in SRE. I think that would be kind of a cool thing. It doesn't exist as far as I know. So a lot of people, especially coming from systems backgrounds, coming from infrastructure backgrounds, or alternatively coming from traditional developer backgrounds and moving into these new circles, these new spheres of interest. This, in a lot of ways, is, I don't want to say uncharted waters, but a lot of it is stuff you're going to have to learn yourself as you teach yourself, learn from your peers, that your peers are helping you to learn, right? So that capacity for auto-engagement is very, very important. And having a wide range of technical interests is important as well. Any organization is going to have those hyper-focused, snipers who are absolutely domain level experts or domain experts in their particular field. And they're the people who are taking that ball and they're running with it, right? SREs often have that one or two little hyper-focus areas, but having the ability to look broad as well as deep is an important aspect of high-performing SREs and SRE teams. The last three here are interconnected. You have to be great at communicating in different ways. This is super, super critical. You as individually, as a member of an SRE team or as an embedded SRE within a product team, you have to be able to communicate not only with members of your own team, you have to communicate with developers who are working on software, you have to communicate with infrastructure people responsible for deploying things. You have to communicate with open source communities when you find bugs in software. Communicate with those same communities when you propose pull requests, for example. When something goes wrong, and inevitably something will go wrong, how do you communicate with managers? How do you communicate with directors, VPs, CEOs, right? During the postmortem, how do we communicate effectively on what went wrong and how we're going to prevent that thing from going wrong in the future? Communication skills are paramount, paramount, paramount. You have to be big on teamwork. Mutual trust is critical, right? No man is an island. You may have heard this expression, and no SRE is an island either, right? We work in and around and within teams. And finally, that last point here, we talk about self-teaching, we talk about communicating, we talk about teamwork, leads to this final point, which you have to be interested in and passionate to some degree about mentoring, about teaching, because this is critical. SREs have backgrounds. Again, SREs are people. At Datadog, certainly we've found great SRE talent from traditional ops or developer profiles, right? But also from our customer success agents, right? Team cake, we call them here at Datadog. We have SREs that have PhDs in computer science. We have SREs that have dropped out of high school. Great SRE talent can come from anywhere. Don't focus on that. Focus on those personality traits, right? Because that's really what's going to lead you to that great talent. The last thing I want to talk about here is team and organizational structure. We're going to whip through this so that we can get to that Q&A component so that you can have an opportunity to ask questions about this and to challenge us on some of this material and get that discussion going. So we talk about team and organizational structure. We're going to be talking about three things. We're going to talk about product teams, we're going to talk about squads, and we're going to talk about guilds. This is how we've organized ourselves at Datadog. And the reason I want to talk about these three things is because it plays directly into how we have built and continue to apply our SRE program, which Leo is going to get into in just a few moments. So what is a product team? A product team can be very large, right? Sometimes really, really large. So the idea is that every single role, function, responsibility that needs to be addressed for within a product is accounted for within that team by at least one person, ideally more than one. And that's the idea, right? So that you have this stack, right, of software that drives the product. You have almost like have a stack of people that are driving that stack as well. It is self-sustaining to a certain degree. And again, it gets always fuzzy around the edges, people cycling in and out, embeds and so on and so forth. But the idea is that that product team is more or less self-sustaining. And what does it support? It supports the product, right? An interesting aspect here, I'm going to go off piste here for a moment, is that this is basically how DevOps, that lofty idea of DevOps, scales, is product teams. And if you have questions about that, definitely ask about what I mean by that. A little challenge for you there. What's a squad? So a squad is sort of like the opposite of a product team. A squad is a short-term group, okay, that organizes to solve sort of a single problem or organizes really to achieve a single goal, maybe is a better way of thinking about it. Perhaps you do OKRs at your organization. A squad could be organized in order to achieve an OKR, for example, right? The idea is that the squad wants to get after an issue that wouldn't neatly fit on a team, a single product team, for example, or ideally benefit a large number of teams across an organization, right? So at Datadog, previous examples here have included topics around recruiting, around analytics. We organize squads to put our hackathons together, for example, right? So define a goal, put a little team of stakeholders together, time box it, and this is super important, and then run at that goal, right? And either you achieve it and everybody wins, or the time box ends, you dissolve the squad. Either way, you're doing a postmortem. Again, we can talk about that a little bit more and how we apply that at Datadog afterwards. Finally, guilds. Guilds are sort of in between the two, right? So the idea behind a guild is that it owns and shepherds an important part of, say, for example, architecture that crosses products, that crosses boundaries. It owns and shepherds cultural elements within an organization, again, that cross many teams. Guilds are larger than squads, generally smaller than product teams, and we could think of them as being semi-permanent, right? A guild isn't necessarily designed to last forever, but it can last for a while, quarters, even years, depending on the scope and the longevity of the thing that the guild is trying to accomplish. Previous examples of this, chez nous, have included guilds around front end, for example. We have an on-call guild, and it doesn't necessarily mean people are literally on call. It means how do we make on-call life better, right? So some ideas for you there. Again, DevOps is an idea, SRE is a practice. So you could have a cohort of site reliability engineers organized and managed as a group. That would be an SRE team. You could also embed SREs and so on and so forth, right? SRE teams are versatile, code reviews, incident reports, facilitating postmortems. And I should add a bullet point here is that you really want to get SREs in as early as possible in a product lifecycle, right? The early that you open the door, talking with your SREs, talking with the people who are ultimately responsible for supporting your product, the better the outcome is going to be. SREs could support a dedicated portfolio, a product team, And SREs sometimes will be on that portfolio for the length of the product. Sometimes they'll rotate in and out. It's up to you to figure out what works for your organization. Last thing I want to mention here is, are SREs embedded? Are they standalone? Are they teams? How does it work? And the answer is, it depends. To quote another member of our community team, Waldo, I hate to give an it depends, but it depends. So your organization is going to be different from ours. It's going to be different from Google, right? It depends on your reality. It depends on your products. It depends on the scope and the size of your teams, and how you're doing on a recruiting path, and so on and so forth, right? So experiment with this. Try different things. Be willing to fail. That's important. And be willing to learn from that failure. And this is where that CAMS acronym really comes into play, right? That the idea of culture and measuring and sharing is going to help you figure out what your SRE journey looks like. All right. So with that, let's open it up to a little bit of Q&A. Leo, are you here with us?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan, for the introduction and presenting the few concepts that I think are a good part of what we do every day. So excited to answer some questions about this.
For sure. So I'm just going to take a look here at the Q&A panel. We have a great question here to open us up. So thank you, Anonymous. Are there any differences between a squad and a tagger team? And but perhaps first, what is a tagger team?
Obviously, I think I hate to give the answer. It depends, but I think we might get into this, this answer again. So maybe Dan, if you have like an example of a tagger team that would help. But I think really what the big like criteria, I think, for distinguishing a squad, at least in the way we think about them at Datadog, and again, like that really would depend on how you want to implement them, like depending on the goals you're trying to achieve there, is that the squad is limited in time. Like it has a finite amount of time usually you dedicate to it, and it should end with kind of the objectives that you're trying to fulfill at the beginning. Obviously, as always, and I think we've talked about DevOps a lot. There is the notion that you iterate, right? So the objective might change a little bit over the course of what you're doing in the squad. But in my experience, mostly, maybe a couple of quarters. I think that's what makes the most sense here. But yeah, if the person wants to give us a little bit more of an example of what they've used tagger teams for, like I think maybe that would be useful to try to see what's the difference.
For sure. So while we wait for Anonymous to follow up on tagger teams, so in my experience, I don't know that there's a ton of difference between a squad and a tagger team necessarily. Some of that might just be semantics, right? We prefer one term or another in our particular organization. If we wanted to split hairs, I think we might suggest that a tagger team in some ways might even be more hyper-focused than a squad, and might even be more short-lived than a squad, right? But I think there, again, we're just splitting hairs at that point.
Yes, totally. And clearly, I think we might have, used that terminology here at Datadog, but we didn't really feel the need. Like we've still used the terminology squad for things sometimes that, were spun up after an incident. For instance, we assemble remediation squads, for instance, for some specific incidents that were spanning multiple teams, and where like it was useful to get these people, organized together to get to a goal, like even like for a few days or weeks. But yeah, maybe it's just a question of really definition and naming things, right? So whatever the name, I think is a debate that you will never get to win eventually. So I'm happy with both terms. I guess they make sense.
Speaking of naming things, we got another great question here, also from Anonymous. So thank you for that. What is, if any, the difference between an SRE and a DevOps engineer? And Leo, I know that you have some ideas on this, some opinions on this, and I do too. I'm a DevOps purist, right? So maybe I should just Leo, is there Any difference between an SRE and a DevOps engineer?
I don't know if I'm in the category of DevOps purist, so maybe I'll again start with a disclaimer. I think the difference is, really uh, sometimes described as what Dan called out earlier, like in the definition of the SRE Google book, as like the generic principle is DevOps, and then SRE is kind of an implementation of this. And so when you think about it, an engineer anyway is going to be someone focused on implementation, and so on DevOps or SRE, I think it really doesn't make a big difference. I think in the industry though, and we have to be realistic, we likely started mostly with DevOps as a concept, and then SRE came a little bit later. And so sometimes people associate it with the notion historically that DevOps is a little bit more focused on some of the early principles that we've talked about when DevOps was introduced. So, like all of the iterative work between ops and dev mixed together in teams, and the concepts of continuous deployment, continuous integration, etc. Whereas, when you tend to see SRE in our industry, maybe it refers a little bit more to the concepts that we've talked about at the beginning in the intro, like automation or like the incident management part, for instance, or just like something that's a bit more operational. So maybe it's just like historical at this point, and we shouldn't really focus and dwell on that. So for me, like for instance at Datadog, I don't think we make too much of a difference. We've used the term SRE, but that's just obviously some sort of an arbitrary choice. Like for instance, we could lose the S because site, in the sense of Datadog, maybe it doesn't have the same meaning as it had for Google, and I guess for many teams that use SRE in the industry. So reliability engineering might also make sense as a naming for this position. RE, maybe that sounds less cool than SRE. I don't know. Like we can argue about this, but I think they're really, for me, like kind of the same category and profiles that Dan was talking about with the different traits. And obviously we can go maybe a bit more in details about what those traits mean in practice as well.
For sure. So we had some more great questions coming in. I want to make sure we get to as many of them as possible. So a question from Ben: what are the pros and cons of SRE as a standalone team?
So I have a very biased view on this one because at Datadog, we started with a standalone team, SRE, and then eventually moved to a different model. So maybe this experience maybe shows something for us, which again might be different from what you might have as an objective in your organization, Ben. So I guess we started as a standalone team because, to be honest, that's the easiest thing to do, right? Like you start a team, you recruit for it, and you get this team working on kind of the core principles and domains of SRE, like things like automation, deployments, monitoring, etc., etc. The problem is, as this other group that Dan mentioned, that the product team starts scaling up. You have many different product domains that are deeper and deeper over time. Technically, they require a lot of understanding of what's happening in this product domain and the technology that's being used by those teams to start having like that impact that you want as an SRE, like the impact on reliability, the impact on automation, the impact on understanding the different problems. We were talking about problem solving earlier. And over time, you tend to see that with more product domains, at least that's what we've seen at Datadog, if we had like a standalone team that wasn't really matrixed or embedded into different parts of the org, we were a little bit struggling getting to that technical depth. And so this is why today we have made the choice of developing embedded teams in different product domains that we have, which helps them specialize. And problem solving in domain A might be different from problem solving in domain B. as well as reliability in domain A might mean a different thing than in domain B. And that specialization has like brought us really, I think, just more focus and more impact as reliability engineers. And maybe the other criteria here was that when we did that change, we still thought that standalone teams were very efficient in some things because there are some initiatives, like some core initiatives, I would say, from site reliability engineering that aren't specialized. When you think about incident management, when you think about chaos engineering, or just monitoring in general, this is not really specific to any domain or any team. And this is the reason why we've actually kept a few standalone teams, but they work on like very specific functional domains, such as chaos engineering, for instance, building a chaos engineering platform for engineers at Datadog, or focused on resilience engineering and focused on our incident retrospective and remediation, for instance. But I think the answer, and I hate to be repeating it, is it depends, because you might see here that if maybe the scope is a little bit different, you might benefit more from a standalone team, and it might be the right way to go first. And just this question of iteration and feedback loop for me, which is important, like evolving with your organization as well. Like SRE always kind of goes along what's happening on the rest of the company, right? So I think this might even change over time. So it's not like a best choice or like the better choice. I think it's just one choice that makes sense at one point in time, and that might change in the future, obviously.
Yeah, and that's 100% correct. I want to actually loop back to what you said about having a starting point, but being willing to evolve, right? It might make sense to put together an SRE team as a standalone unit and have them work together with a particular product or a particular aspect of your organization, just to get a feel for, okay, what do these people do? How are they interacting with each other? What might this look like within the context of our organization? And then don't engrave the stone tablets right away. Right? Be willing again to iterate, to experiment, and to learn from those experiments. All right. So this actually leads right to another excellent question. If we want to take a step back, right, to that, wait, how do we begin? How do we actually start? Right? So another question from Anonymous. What advice would you give to a company or team who's looking to start adopting DevOps for the first time? What metrics would you define to show early on if it's being successful or not?
That's a great and difficult question. I think it's very natural to start with the desire to monitor some KPI, some indicator that tells you what's going on, like in terms of reliability, for instance. And kind of the reason I think that the SRE book was very successful is that they started defining some of these indicators. Like, people might be familiar with the notion of SLI, service level indicator, SLO, service level objective, and error budgets. And this is traditionally what people have been focusing on in the SRE domain to measure reliability. And one thing to note, though, is I think, and maybe remember especially when starting, is that it's very hard to measure things in an unbiased, truthful way. Like, be the customers that you have, and like have this perception. Sometimes the metric you will choose or the indicator you will choose will be green, but some customers might still be frustrated. So it's always, again, like an iteration, finding whatever like is the right definition for understanding what are the user journeys, the user stories. That's another term that the SRE book, I think, dwells on, that you care about. So obviously this is natural to start with this. Usually, start with an SLI, an SLO for your product, and then start tracking like your availability, depending on the system. That might be availability that you care about, or some sense of latency, some sense of durability, or freshness, for instance. There's a couple of different criteria that are pretty generic here that you might get. But I think
Sounds like
Maybe
you're
something else.
touching on the golden metrics there, right? The golden
Oh yeah,
signals.
yes, 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 and clearly, this is really something very core. Like we work on every day with, and that obviously I think are very useful. But I think there is another part of it, and to get back to the philosophy that Dan was talking about, I think there is a real cultural aspect about SRE, and this is something that you tend to have like a more difficult time, I think, to measure. But when you think about the burden, like the operational burden that exists for a team, how can you measure that? Obviously, you can measure the number of times you wake up someone on call off business hour, or you can measure the amount of time you spend in incident response. These things could be good indicators, but sometimes there are things that are invisible as well. Someone does something small but repeatedly, as Dan was saying, and then how can you measure really this? Is it something that ends up in your work tracking system, or it's difficult to say. So I think something that makes a lot of sense when you start is measuring the KPIs, the SLIs, the SLOs, focusing on their budgets. But I think culturally, it's also listening to those signals. Like, are teams happy with how operations run? Are your customers happy with the product? Like, this comes through more informal channels. Unfortunately, sometimes it's hard to put a graph on it. But I think this is very important to still listen to this, especially early on, because early on, usually when you start something, you want to show impact. So you want to take some signals. Maybe they're biased, but at least see, if they improve over time. And I think this for some of our teams, like initially when they started, that was very powerful to show that SRE was useful, because we could show some impact on these specific things that cause frustration in the engineering teams and for our customers.
Yeah, and that's 100% it. Targeting those frustrations, right? Aim at the pain points, right? If you're aiming at the pain points, you're probably aiming at the right things. But then there's also that aspect of, okay, are we treating symptoms or are we treating causes here, right? How would you start to tease that out?
I think something that's really key usually when you start SRE is you start talking about two kinds of reliability, and really it's a simplistic view. So bear with me for a second, but usually we have reactive reliability and proactive reliability. So reactive is usually where you start because this is the most obvious thing. There is smoke somewhere, there's a fire, you see it, you want to extinguish it, and this is totally natural. This is obviously something that shows a lot of impact, but is more focused on the short term. And then focusing on proactive reliability is usually what comes next naturally, because then you're not trying to see just the next step, but you're trying to say, with my experience with other risks I know in the system, with my staff, my objectives for the product, how can I anticipate best? And it's about system design, it's about automation, it's about also staffing and training and education. So how you talk about your systems, and you train engineers to be on call for that system. How can you do that as much as you can upfront to anticipate and improve reliability proactively with this? And maybe I add like a third leg to this, which is something that I think is becoming more and more of a topic in our industry, in computer science, in technology: resilience engineering. And this is something that existed for decades in other industries, industrial, transportation, etc. But this is this concept that even if we do reactive reliability very good, even if we do proactive reliability very good, we'll never get 100% coverage. So, at some point, something is going to fail. And I think Dan said that very bluntly, but I think this is just the truth. Like, nothing is going to be ever 100% reliable. So resilience engineering also focuses on that third domain, which is, I think, very interesting and usually comes a little bit later after you started SRE. But it focuses on basically, being prepared to be unprepared, which seems very counterintuitive. But you can actually, focus on, for instance, learning from your incidents, learning from how people operate systems and what failure they've seen in the past, things like that. And I think these three things go very well hand in hand together, but you tend to usually start with one, which is in my experience is more the reactive reliability and treating a lot of the direct short-term symptoms you see in production, but then slowly you start being more proactive and even starting then investing in more of building resilience in the teams.
For sure. And speaking about resiliency, that's where something like chaos engineering, right, can come into play, where we're just unleashing the unleashing the monkey and seeing what happens, and is all our hard work actually going to end up paying off? So thinking then a little bit about toolings, a little bit about systems. Another good question here. We're gonna bring it back every time. Question from Anonymous: what common frameworks or tooling do you think are core to what SRE should provide to engineering organizations as they grow? Thinking about monitoring, thinking about deployments, thinking about RCAs, things of this nature.
I think this attendee said it all. Like, I think monitoring and observability in general, I think, is something that brings you a lot of value, usually when you implement reliability engineering teams, because you can measure, you can track improvement over time. You can also start describing problems more accurately because you have things to look at, and this helps, like this problem solving approach we were talking about earlier. You find yourself in situations and incidents where you don't know, like something's broken, but you don't know what it is. And clearly tools that help improve observability in general. So we're talking about metrics in general, but also distributed tracing, logs. There's a lot of different data sources that you can use, but it's really helpful to do this problem solving in real time, in production, because the problems won't care about how you organize your teams, right? They'll just happen, and then you realize that team A needs to be involved, and actually it's between team A and team B, or somewhere between team B and team C. Like, we don't really know. And this is where, like, using an observability tool, using something that helps teams also talk to each other with the same kind of terminology and kind of same really like the same approach, like in terms of the same tools, I think that helps. Maybe the natural addition to that is the RCS, or root cause analysis. I personally, like, maybe I'm a root cause purist, to paraphrase Dan. I prefer talking about contributing factors, because I think that in many incidents, there's more usually than just one root cause, that there's a lot of different aspects about an incident that contribute to it. So, social, human factors, technical factors, etc. So I think focusing on that part, like the retrospective, the follow-up after an incident, I think this is also very natural, because it shows that you care about understanding what this failure means, and you care about becoming better. And I think this is also like a very important concept about SRE. We want to learn from the past and shape the future. Obviously, the future is different from the past, so we'll need to course correct, but this is something that is also very, I think, key in SRE. So incident management in general, with the focus on retrospectives, and then the observability in general. And maybe, like, if I had something new, it's also like the focus around deployment and automation that Dan talked about.
Excellent. Well, we have just a very short amount of time left, so I'm going to fire some rapid fire questions at you here at the end. First one, do we use Datadog to monitor Datadog?
Yes, we do Datadog for Datadog by Datadog. Yes, that's correct.
Excellent. Okay, second question. How large is our SRE organization at Datadog?
So right now it's almost spanning 10 teams, and we have over 60 people, like, in the SRE organization. This is something quite new, because, as I said, originally we used the standalone model. So we've grown that team quite a lot, from just one small team to those many teams. So yeah, that's kind of the scale.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we only got 30 seconds left. There's still lots of questions here in the Q&A. Just so everybody, if you ask the questions, we are going to collect those, and we are going to work through those. I'll talk with Leah. We'll see if we can get some answers to those questions out to you. Maybe there's a blog post in the Wix. We'll see how that comes along. But thank you so much for attending the session. Thank you so much, Leo, for taking the time out to speak with me, and to our audience. If this was good and you want more good content, we're doing it again tomorrow on a Europe friendly time zone. Thanks, everybody.